This is Duke University.
Thanks for having me. It's just an honor to be back here. I was here, it was almost a year ago, Laurent, I think. And every time I see Laurent, I have this temptation to try out my bad French.
It's getting better all the time.
So I have to repress that urge. You don't want to inflict yourself on people, at least not all the time. Maybe like 50% of the time. But it's an honor to be back here. And I'll say, once again, what I said last time I was here, I don't live in a world of scholarship. I live in a world of I live with my wife and my son, first of all. That's my primary contact, who I love very much and very intelligent people. But in my professional work, I live around journalists. And obviously I love journalism, love the craft of journalists, work with really, a great number of really, really intelligent people, which for that reason always makes the gulf between the academy and what we can term, I guess, as the more popular publications, agonizing to me. Deeply, agonizing, because there's so much wisdom in the academy. I believe last time I was here, Martha approached me, about this, and I said, I don't want to say that she did. I don't want to say that the academy is perfect. That's one thing. You were talking about how historians contribute to the problem themselves sometimes, and so I want to be aware of that. At the same time, I don't want to conceal my delights and my joy at at being back here and just having the opportunity to listen to folks and bounce ideas off of an audience. But when you work and write for popular publications, I'm saying this morning, again, this is a testament to the distance. People often say, to me, why are you such a downer? Why are you so depressing? And I wish, I hope maybe, like, this being live stream, so, maybe some knowledge is going to go out there, because I guarantee you everybody on this panel is going to be more depressing. But all right, I'm going to tell you, these folks, this is not going to be flowers, candy, and rainbows here. It never is, and then when you're having a serious conversation, it never is. So, I just want to say I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be back. I'm delighted to be here with you guys. I'm looking forward to your questions. You guys missed the top secret session this morning, so that knowledge is not, maybe a little bit will leak out. But I'm really happy to be here. I had the privilege of having breakfast this morning with Beryl and Martha, and Baldwin just suffuses everything. James Baldwin just suffuses. And I think we're in the midst of some sort of renaissance right now. I'm seeing conferences everywhere, and I don't know how Baldwin ever got lost in the first place. Maybe there are folks who never lost him to begin with. But he's back in these times. I don't know if it's Ferguson. I don't know what's going on. But I was at breakfast this morning, and Bro was talking about just how on this question, reparations, how on it James Baldwin was. She was just making a suggestion that in her dream, the fire next time would be assigned to everyone. And I thought like I had this like mystical mind melt. I've been thinking about that for the past few months. Myself, and I think one of the ways I want to position this conversation to begin with is we can talk about the practicalities of reparations, but I am mostly interested in what reparations does to the idea of American identity itself, and to whiteness in particular. One of the things that I've become convinced of over the past year is that the real problem is that reparations, the very idea of it, necessarily means the destruction of white identity, the very idea of calling yourself white. And so, in honor of Baldwin, I'm just going to open up, just with a really, really quick reading from the fire next time. And then I would love to, throw the floor out to my co-panelists here. You guys can feel free to respond to that idea of what, reparations means to, American identity, or you, steer the, conversation where you guys would like it to go. Okay, so Baldwin says, and he's, this is at the beginning, bro. This is actually from the beginning part, where he's talking to his nephew, and he's trying to get his nephew to understand, actually to be sympathetic towards white people. That's what he's really trying to do. And he says that, he's talking about where black people, where black folks exist in history, what role they play in white identity. And he says to his nephew, they are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better. But as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You would be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. So when I think about reparations, I think about it reversing, a pillar of white American identity in this country, or white identity period, if we want to talk about internationally. And that, I think, poses perhaps the greatest threat more than the practicality. I wrote this piece on the case for reparations, and I've said this, and I'm going to keep saying this. No book, with perhaps one exception, and I'm thinking of another great book, but no book, perhaps besides, oh God, what's the great migration book? Warmth of Other Suns. There's two books that are really responsible: Warmth of Other Suns and Beryl Satter's book, Family Properties, which is just absolutely tremendous. Absolutely connected a lot of dots, and I was telling her that this morning. And so, if we could, I guess we'll just move from the right and just come on down. You can, start us off.
Oh, I'll get you started. Okay. Well, thank you. We had this great discussion this morning, and where I can't come in, I obviously I think this idea of shifting white identity and creating chaos is part of what Baldwin says, but he also says it's the only chance for real growth. And so I'm, from white ethnic background. My grandparents were in Russia, in the 1890s. That's when they came and things like that. So we were talking about how like some white ethnic types who feel like we weren't here when really bad things happened to black people, so this is none of our problem. What my book did was sort of try to overturn that idea by talking about the ongoing extraction of wealth from captive black markets, mostly through real estate, in the 1950s onward. And it came in the 50s to, in Chicago, my father estimated $1 million a day taken out of black Chicagoans. It's a population of 1 million people. But money that is taken, that because of systematic housing discrimination, meant that there's no way they could strengthen their own communities. The money that would go for colleges, the money that would go for home upkeep, the money that would go to maybe keeping one parent to be with the kid instead of both working, that's all taken out of the community in a very, very systematic way. And what I wrote about was people facing this, seeing it, and trying to fight it. And there's a cost to it. And one of the things I wrote about in my book is the cost to it to whites who try to fight it. But there's also a cost to whites who don't. There's a cost in the lie that you live in. I think that has to be part of the conversation. Is like everyone needs to benefit from a complicated reality that is a mature reality of life. So another thing that I try to do in my work is shift the discussion from the South to the North in terms of a systematic exploitation of African Americans in terms of not just life and limb, but wealth and property. It is very easy to always blame the South, and my students in the North, I teach in Newark, they're always like, well, we know about the Southerners, but they don't know anything about the people in their own town or the redlining of the entire town of Newark, the entire city. That you could not get loans there. And this is what they live with every single day. The broad sweep that Ta-Nehisi did in his article is beautiful and important, but I sometimes say, maybe start with the present, go back instead of the past and go forward, because then people can see how every day they are living with the repercussions of a institutional system that may have nothing to do with someone saying vicious things to you on a personal level. And that's the more complicated thing. And once you face that and you can learn from it, there is a certain power on all sides, actually. There's a power of knowing how power works. There's something exciting about demystifying power relations. And I think the discussion about reparations can do that. And so, cataclysmic as it is to have the stars go dark, whatever it is, on the other hand, it's like, oh my God, I get it. Now I understand not only, my life, but I once you understand power relations in one place, you tend to get it most places. And understanding the systematic exploitation of Black people in this country from the beginning on is a way to understand power relations and to think of a more humane way to live. So I'll sort of try to represent the side that feels that reparations would, of some form, whether it's just beginning with the simple understanding of it, to an actual transfer of capital, can lead to growth and strength among all Americans, potentially.
Martha, we had this conversation, I left a little bit of this week out. You can feel free to talk about this as much as possible, but I think you have like a very good philosophical conversation this morning about what was possible within the structures that we have. And beyond that, one of the things, Martha's my constant interlocutor and questioner on Twitter. And one of the things you said, you have to read, okay, confession, I haven't read Derek Bell. I'm just going to be embarrassed about that. Shame me now from things that I read. And Martha's like, listen, you got to read Derek Bell. You're out here saying things that you think are original. They are not. You're a controversial. And you were talking about, Derek Bell has very much like almost this apocalyptic idea, I would say, of what is possible. So I wonder how you come to the discussion. Is this even, a discussion, is reparations presumed that something can actually happen to fix it? Is this even a worthwhile discussion to begin with?
And I gifted you Derek Bell.
You did. Thank you
not?
very much.
I look forward to continuing the conversation. But Bell is, for me, a touchstone. And it is because he takes, as a critical legal scholar, a very hard look at the history of this country, and in particularly the dynamics that are race and law in its various iterations across time, and concludes by the time he's writing in the 1980s that racism is a foundational, sustained, permanent feature of this nation. And his critique, his challenge to us, right, is what then? Right? What then when we recognize that there is no point in the American narrative, the North American, the colonial North American, the U.S. narrative, that there is no point in the narrative at which we can say anti-Black racism and white supremacy are not absolutely critical to our understanding and to our theory about how the history of this nation unfolds. And yet, I think Bell is not a pessimist. He's not a pessimist. He's, if nothing else, he was too much of a pedagogue to be a pessimist, right? You can't spend your days, as you all know, in classrooms full of young people and preach only, right? That the nation is but it's a hard challenge. So part of what we came to this morning is talking about scale, and that part of what is so compelling for me about Carl's work is that she reminds us that even in the face of profound structural inequality, structural aggression in the mid-20th century, that within a community like Chicago, it is possible for folks to raise their own consciousness, right, about the system in which they live and make their lives, buy their homes, raise their families, become part of communities, and that on that scale, it's possible for folks to organize, to come together, to challenge the equation that is race and power in a city like Chicago and extract something more than mere symbolic gestures, but to renegotiate the conditions of their own communities, of their own families, of their own lives, I think, so I take from Bell, not the nihilism, but the kind of the necessity of thinking about scale as part of the challenge to white supremacy.
I'm so sorry, I just have to interrupt here. But how do we deal with the fact, and please feel free to jump in. How do we deal with the fact that the vast, so Beryl story tells, in I guess one of the three lines is the story of the contract buyers league, right? And they're African. But the vast majority of people that got ripped off in Chicago, I mean, they got nothing. They just got nothing at the end of the day. I mean, how do we, not fall into cynicism, knowing that? I mean, how do we think about that?
People, a lot of people didn't get anything back, but they did pass, they did help lead to the movement that passed the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act,
Right.
the Community Reinvestment Act, which have funneled, lots and lots and lots of money into some communities. Anyway, some people, so we might not benefit individually, but other people benefited. And like the only reason we have any handle at all on what is happening with the subprime mortgage crisis right now is because of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act that they pushed to get going, that they get no credit for, and people think they get a passive idea that Congress decided it would be nice to let people know where the banks are taking money, where they're loaning, and that they're taking from black communities and loaning in white ones. But no, it was these people, door to door systematically being willing to tell very upsetting stories about how they got ripped off and to do the investigation to understand that. So, it might not be one-on-one.
Martha, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think, and we would link Beryl's story about Chicago to Tamar Carroll's new work on the Lower East Side of New York, right? And I think we could tell a different narrative about this mid-20th century moment when, in fact, we could write about Los Angeles and San Francisco. We could look at the ways Baltimore. We could look at the ways in which many cities in the country, the dynamic that she captures so eloquently is present. And at the same time, I think that what your piece does for me is reinforce the sense, because you come back to these folks in 2014, you remind us that part of the narrative, our narrative, is about survival, right? And you remind us about the way in which folks are survivors, and how survival manifests itself, right, is not going to be in a one-on-one, one-to-one equation, right? That yes, homes are lost, right? Families' hard-earned wages are lost, but that narrative of survival, I think, is essential, right, to combat the sense of pessimism that Bell might invoke in you, right? Is that sense of the value of survival, and you show us that in your piece in a way that I think is very important for me.
So I want to pose to you a question that I get all the time. Do you have any expectation of seeing reparations in your lifetime?
No, I don't. But no, I don't. In part because I think, and so I'm going to come to this as a political science. It's just the difficulties of making something like that politically happen. But it doesn't mean that it's not worth the effort. So I want to say something about other places, just as when going back to your first question of how reparations may challenge national identities, and just say a bit about Australia for a moment, right? The Aboriginal peoples there. Right? So there would be no one gainsaying the difficulties that Aboriginal people have faced in Australia. And part of the story of their mistreatment, in addition to general dispossession, was this policy of nearly 100 years of taking Aboriginal children away from their parents and putting them in white homes and the rest of it. And there was a commission that was formed by Labour government, and it started, became the occasion for what has been known as the history wars, because at stake was, how did Australians think about their history, right? Or did we come and dispossess and consider the place of empty land and for legal means and effectively justify the dispossession, or were we people who weren't here quite as nobly as we like to think of ourselves as, fleeing from England, a penal colony and the like, that we're just mates? We weren't mates. We were conquerors to Aboriginal people. And there was a huge, it kind of occupied Australian political discourse. And it wasn't buried in the papers. It was number one, right? And it would seem to be a far removed from changing the day-to-day experiences of Aboriginal people, talking about scale. But what it did to was provide the biggest framework possible for placing Aboriginal demands, right? Which is we are not marginal, we are central to the Australian story. You cannot talk about Australia without talking about our dispossession, although we are less than 2% of the population, but you cannot talk about your history without us, right? And by talking about our history and including our dispossession and our mistreatment in it, you are forced to take our aspirations seriously, that we matter. Because part of the story has been, you don't matter. We don't have to take your aspirations seriously. We don't have to form governance where your interests are protected. We don't have to think about distributing public funds where you get what you deserve as citizens. We don't have to do that, right? But now, when you begin to change the narrative, it makes Aboriginal claims politically more powerful, even if, and that on kind of a larger scale. But then the challenge is making that real, right? So once you have some broad agreement, which wasn't always agreed upon, right? So it's split pretty clearly left and right to introduce politics here. The left, Labour Party pretty much went along with it. The right party said, no, our history is more than dispossession and mistreatment. We are proud people who came here and built this land for nothing. And people still hold to that, right? But nationalist views are not, unique to Australia or the U.S. or Japan. Any country has its nationalist myths, and we're no different. But you have, in the end, they challenged them as best they could. But now, the next step is trying to make this more concrete, and this is when it gets much more difficult, right? So it may happen at the national level, but then you've got the provinces, the equivalent of states, and then cities and the like, and Aboriginal people asking for some kind of reparations of sorts, right? So I met a woman who's since passed away. She was pretty young, Aboriginal woman whose parents, she was removed from her parents' care. She was put in a home, and she remembers seeing files of her. She described to me files that had her parents, pictures of her parents, and next to them these measurements of their skulls and stuff. And she just, because that's how they were viewed. And so she wanted to claim mistreatment and take the case to court. She didn't end up taking her case to court, but there was a case that did go to court. So here would be a legal strategy, much the same as African Americans use legal strategies here. So her claim was to say, I was harmed by my mistreatment, by being removed from my parents' care, right? Even if my parents had me in a desert, it was better than being mistreated with where I was put, because I was with the love and care of my parents. This person, one case that came through, he ended up losing the case. The case, they said that he had a hard life as an adult, and they said, yes, your life has been hard, right? But we cannot claim direct liability for the misfortune in your life. So there is not a causal connection. He wanted to make a causal connection. My misfortune as an adult is connected to my mistreatment. The court said no. Okay, so there's a high legal standard, but a legal standard. I'm not going to talk about. We got lawyers here, right? But a legal standard is not a political standard, right? Right. So what may not work in the courts is the role of public policy, right, and of legislators, and of people who get elected, and therein is where politics begins, right? So as much as we oftentimes are disgusted by our national politics, and certainly we are disgusted of late. That's all true, but we cannot see the public sphere. I mean, you can't give it up and say, this is the one thing that we have to deliberate our claims. If we give up on politics, what else is there? No, that is the other option. No, that's true. And in some countries it comes to that too, because one would say, now I'm like,
I'm not being flippant. I'm not endorsing
it. And I can't be like head of the political science department talking revolution.
No. It's like, I don't want anybody getting that.
What I do want to say this is that what is true, though, the human history, is that when the stakes are high enough, and when the interests are sharp enough, and when there is no compromise, and when there appears to be an elite, however described, that is unwilling to share, to redistribute in a way that the masses of people expect, usually you have violence. Or you set up institutions that make those elite accountable. With the threat of violence, which is that if you do not, that's what taxation is, right? If you do not, it's the idea, okay, we pay taxes, you protect us. Now, if you're not protecting us, then then there's a problem. Then we have to renegotiate our basis of relationship with our state. So citizen-state relations. That's kind of a basic of human governance. So everybody has to, all countries, all societies at some point have to figure out how well their institutions serve their populace. And arguably, part of what we're seeing now in the U.S. is kind of our dissatisfaction with American politics because our institutions seem to be failing us. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But for the issue of reparations, it fails us. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't press the issue. And part of it will be changing the narrative. Let me just say one final thing. All of these places where there have been apologies or anything of the sort, it started out with the commission. A commission starts out embodied by legislatures and comes up with historical record. That has been the basis of everything. We have yet to get the HR 40 bill. So if you just use that, it's just the most basic step, right? That becomes the basis. Your article, frankly, is like our HR 40, right? In the absence of having the U.S. Congress produce one, right? So one could say, what is the harm in a report? Well, what a report does is that it provides the platform for politicians to begin to talk about, right? So in all the cases where they're in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, where they've had movement regarding Aboriginal issues, it starts with a commission, as kind of innocuous as that seems.
I so appreciate, well, I appreciate everything you just said, but I really appreciate that final note because one of the, I've gone out and talked about it, people say, well, what's the next step? I say, HR 40 is the next step. And they kind of like, their face just sort of truth, right? But I think, it's politics though. This is like politics. This is how, HR 40, and I'm glad you were able to cast a much wider net than I'm able to, but, the thing I was familiar with was how Japanese American reparations happened here. It started with a committee. That's politics, and I think, like the tension very much is on the one hand, these big sort of existential questions about reparations where we started out. And yet the fact of grinding work of how, something like that would actually happen. You think about, well, is this possible? And I pretty much, conclude like in my lifetime, probably my kids' lifetime, probably my grandkids' lifetime, it's not possible, right? But again, we kind of got at this morning. I just don't know if there's another option. Period. Like I don't know if there's a way out. People talk about reparations as though, well, we could do this, we could do that, or we could have reparations, and I don't see any sort of anything. If you're interested in the destruction of white supremacy in this country, that's it. There is no other way, where you get out of this without making good on past harm. Because I think one of the things that happens, the killer thing, just to go back, the killer thing about Beryl's book that I think it sets up is here you have a community, and people who live in that community understand that something happened to them. They may not be able to tell you the policy, but I got to tell you, as young as like 6 years old, Black folks understood like the basic idea of reparations. We were robbed of something. And we don't have all the studies or the science or the redlining maps to break it out and tell you. But I know that where I am right now is not an accident. I know it ain't my biology. I know it ain't my culture. Something happened here, And so the ability to see in a book, here's what actually happened. Here's what happened, And one of the deeply sad things is there was a paper that I read just as I was getting to the end of writing the book, and it was talking about the subprime lending crisis. And it was talking about where banks went. One of the deeply depressing things is because of segregation and because of redlining, if you were looking for an efficient means to distribute or to pawn off subprime loans, you would go to those neighborhoods that were made possible by redlining in the first place, because it organized a group of people in one area that you could exploit. So it's like you don't really have an option of looking away. I'm working on this piece about mass incarceration, and it's very, very much the same thing. The old segregation, the old racism makes the new racism. I'm not even sure if it's an old and new thing, but the old act, shall we say, makes the new act possible. And so it's very, very difficult to imagine a possibility of getting away from this. Bro, I just want to go back and ask you. One of the things, there were all these great histories that I read when I was working on the piece, and obviously there were plenty of people, many of them are here among us, and have done great scholarship on reparation. But one of the things I noticed about the historians is I feel like you guys would walk right up to the precipice of it and
I'll
just say,
say it.
somebody should do something about that.
Yeah.
Weak. And did you have that in your head? Like, were you thinking about reparation?
Yeah,
Like,
I was thinking, well, the way I personally was thinking about it was, why talk about slavery when we have this right here with real people, with, real plaintiffs, with, it's so documented,
right.
So my personal feeling was, maybe focusing on a long time, 150 years, whatever, is not as pressing as this generation sitting in front of us, where we know exactly how much wealth is extracted, and it could actually be documented to the letter who and where the money went.
Right.
So I was thinking somebody should take that up, and then where it goes, it goes. I mean, I couldn't. We can't. I mean, I got enough trouble for even writing about my family, much less taking a kind of straightforward stance on that. But I clearly, I was thinking that every second. And while I was writing that book, the subprime stuff was bubbling up slowly. I was still following it from 2001 on, and I kept saying, "Oh my God, here we go! Oh my God, here we go!" And then I was thinking, well, maybe this will help. Give a framework. Because one thing we were talking about is that people are very fluent in, it's your fault you don't work hard enough, and they're not fluent in, it doesn't matter how hard you work, you will never get a penny of credit no matter what, And so I was thinking if I could do that thing to bridge that gap so people have an explanation, it's important. And I was thinking like when you're saying people know something's wrong, like one of the people in Mondale said, we don't walk heavier on the concrete than anyone else, so why is our sidewalk cracked? I mean, we don't weigh more, what's going on, And so that's a hard question to answer actually if you don't have someone explaining it. So we're under hard, strictures to not become overt advocates, but we're under the, we still do it. I just want to say one more thing about Elisa's point about, this may not be in my lifetime, but do it anyway and don't see the public sphere. I just think that is so crucial. And my friend and colleague Mia Bay always says to me, she says, like, since when have political actors just, taken something on because they know they will win? They never have done that. It's always been, we take it on because it's wrong, And so I think that's 100% correct. And that's, I think, a very important thing. And what you did was frame it into, there is a public sphere that we can intervene in. So I think that's very important.
I think in journalism, one of the big problems is a great number, let's just say, of political journalists write as though they're auditioning to be a Senate aide. So the conversation becomes restricted. Okay, so what can get done right now? What's a proposal that I might be able to take credit for in the Clinton administration? It might actually, what I mean, as opposed to this sort of broad, imaginative thing.
Well, and that's why I criticized Saul Alinsky in my book. He's this big organizer because he was all about pragmatism.
Right.
And he's like, well, we'll never get the banks to, first he thought people can't understand redlining, which is wrong. And second, he thought, we'll never get anything back. So we'll stick on winnable things. And by saying he's going to stick to winnable, he meant we will never confront structural problems. And that was a really deep limitation on him. And it took religious people, actually, whether they were black Protestants or white Catholics or, progressive Jews, to say, no, we do it for moral reasons, actually. And we don't care about winning or losing. And, that's not our game plan for now.
Right. And also, it should always be remembered when you make those sort of compromises, which maybe, once the law is written, maybe necessary, you're leaving someone out. I mean, when you say, we're only going to tackle the wars that we can win, you're telling someone, I'm not going to fight on your behalf. That's the other side of it. Before we open it up to questions, I just want to make sure you guys get, one more shot.
So I will offer a perspective on your pointing to HR 40. I'm not going to say your call for serious consideration of HR 40, but you're pointing to HR 40 because I think as a historian of law, what I'd say is like part of the function, law serves one function, right, which is to actually legislate and allocate and reorganize resources. Right? That's one possibility that comes out of something like HR 40. But I would say that the history of law also reminds us that law is a way of organizing a conversation and a national debate, right? And that's what I think HR 40 also offers us, right? Is whether or not it legislates a conversation in the very debate about the bill, right, is that conversation, right? And that's actually one of the functions in the history of law. So a question I have going forward is the way in which this conversation doesn't fuel a different kind of debate when inevitably HR 40 comes up again. I hope so.
Melissa, one more time.
I'm going to concede so that everyone knows.
Okay. All right. I think it's important to leave as much time as possible for you guys. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip you because I'm biased towards people who are students. Maybe you are a student here. Are you a student here? Oh, okay. I just want to make sure students get to. You guys have this great. Are you a student? No. I'll get to you. I promise. We got a half an hour. I will not, leave you guys unanswered. Thank you. Okay, here we go.
Well, I'm a student. But so I guess this is sort of a broad question, but getting back to the idea of American identity. So I'm a very recent immigrant, and one of the things that's striking about how people talk about America that I've not experienced anywhere else is this idea of like the American experiment, and maybe it will fail and maybe it will succeed. And tying that to your point about there being no point in U.S. history in which racism hasn't been fundamental, and that perhaps means that the nation is doomed. And that seems like a very odd way to think to me that because there's no innocence in the past, the sort of moment of innocence to build on, that the future is therefore well themed. So like, is there a different way? I don't have an answer. It's a different way of thinking about history, where the past can have, not that the past isn't important, but that it plays like a different role. Does that make sense?
I'll try. Did I say doomed? I didn't mean
Oh,
to
you
say
said
doomed.
I just made it finish. I didn't mean everyone's gonna die. That'll be okay.
I think the phrase that we were using this morning was more like redemption, right? Can the nation be redeemed?
Yes.
And an acknowledgement that the stories that we tell about ourselves, and history being one of the principal vehicles by which we tell the story of the nation, that the stories that we tell ourselves about the nation have consequences for how we imagine then the future and the possibilities. And therefore, I think we have to ask how this nation tells the story of Black people, Africans, the descendants of Africans, African Americans, because I think there's a power in the telling and the retelling of that story. We know that we can tell that story sort of 1619 forward in one trajectory, right, that your piece sort of ends with. But what is the other story? I guess that's the question, right, for this conversation, is what is the other story that we would tell about ourselves that offers up the possibility for a kind of redemption for the nation on race and justice. I don't have an answer to that, and we are the naysayers in many respects as historians, even if we don't go the distance. But I'm interested in that conversation of the conversation that tells a different story about us, that lets us reimagine what's possible going forward.
Okay.
I just wanted to add, so now I'm way out of my wheelhouse, but it would seem to me that I would leave it to historians of African American culture and music. I mean, you won't see a more kind of optimistic and forward-looking and emancipatory music and arts that come out of Black America, in part as a way of giving, providing the humanity that we've been, denied, and offering the redemption, right? I mean, music is one of the places, without getting romantic about it, right? But just simply to say that there are places where in American history, where in culture, where the hope and the promise of America is located in a more pure way. It seems to be in the arts, right? And a lot of that has been through Black Americans.
Yeah, I actually think I think one of the reasons why I can't wait to dig into this dialogue, the prospect that the nation is doomed needs to be on the table. Now, none of us are prophets, and so I would never go out there and say the nation is. I mean, you just can't know, right? But I think, given what the political culture is of America, what I would call the unearned hope that a lot of us have in the future, it's good to at least have you might fail. Like that. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence that says you might fail. I think like that's a very, very important and realistic notion to have on the table. Just to go back for a second, like I'm working on this piece about mass incarceration, and I think like we're in this moment where a lot of people are feeling hopeful because there's a belief that there's a bipartisan consensus around the issue of mass incarceration. I'm pretty sure this effort is going to fail. I'm pretty sure it's going to fail because how it's conceived now, and this is like why it's important to be serious and to go, fully over, to the dark side and consider how bad things actually are. The mass incarceration light story is that in 1970, we went a little crazy and started jailing a bunch of people. But we were responding to real crime trends. We just kind of went overboard. And suddenly we looked up and we had more incarcerated people than any nation on the earth. 800,000 more people than are incarcerated in China, a country with nearly, 1 million more people. Don't know what happened. No idea. Right? You know what happened. And that gives you some, well, okay, so we'll just fix that. Maybe we can just fix that. Maybe we'll just let out all the people who are in jail for smoking marijuana. Won't that fix it? Maybe we'll just let out all the, people who are there for drug crimes. Won't that fix it? In fact, it won't. Each day, each year, 600,000 people come out of America's prisons and jails. That is the entire population of prisons and jails in 1970. Each day. It's enough, I'm pulling this from Diva Page's great book, Moth. It's enough to fill every fast food job in America 5 times over. Worse still, even if you went back to 1970, and this is the goal, this is what people want to get to. They want to get 1970 would be a success. Even then, you are talking about roughly a 6 or 7 to 1 black to white ratio in prisons. Basically, back to jump, that would be success. That would be success. It's very, very important to have this sort of like penetrating, conversation where people are very, very serious about, what they're facing. I understand why politicians can't always do that. I understand they, have, certain limits on what they can say. That they have a certain amount of hope that they have to broadcast. But I think, certainly here in the academy, and my hope more so, more and more for writers, who are working in the realm, that they allow themselves to go all the way. You have to have some room for political imagination. And political imagination is not just in, as I said, rainbows and, candy. Political imagination has to consider everything. So I think like it's very, very important that we're clear about what the stakes actually are.
Can I just say one thing about this? I think you point out by being a recent immigrant to America, you noticed something about our worldview that we, I think, take for granted, which is this idea of progress. Because when my students come into my class, I tell them, if progress, the belief in progress is something, is like path they feed you in high school to make you complacent. It has nothing to do with reality. Black people had the vote in 1870. They didn't have it in 1890. It's not like that ever. So forget about progress. That's not the narrative. It's about fighting and resisting and fighting and resisting. But nevertheless, when we're talking about making other change, that image of progress crept back in even with us, where we're saying, well, we didn't make progress, so therefore, it's not, we can't do it. And I just think that's such a smart point, that we shouldn't incorporate the myth of progress even as we're critiquing, that America is about progress. So yeah, you're right. History, it doesn't have to be, it never is about that. So why would it be now? I think that's very important. And I think rather than thinking about when we never, we've always been tied up with a racist, exploitative system, and therefore, what can we do? It's better to think about, sort of the changing nature of power relations and when are moments when oppressive situations ease up a bit and push for that.
Oh, way in the back right there.
Me? Yeah, you. In talking, a big theme throughout this, in terms of changing the narrative, I think is seeing the positive view of redress. And in our culture right now, redress, the narrative is it's either a sham, somebody got paid $4 million for pouring coffee on their lap, or it's egregious. What does millions of dollars in punitive damages mean? Or it's seen as, I feel bad about myself because this thing happened, and yes, we need to get over it, and it's this bad thing. And I think a part of this narrative is, what are the positive outcomes of redress? For exactly what you were saying from the very beginning, for those of us who would be inclined for reparations, how much better would we as a culture and a nation be on the other side of redress, rather than just seeing it as this negative hurdle and thing that's be gotten? So I guess my question is, what are great voices or books? A lot of books have come out tonight or today on the positive outcomes of redress. The main stories we hear in the United States are Japanese internment redress, maybe forced sterilization, but there's not a whole bunch for us to look at and say, look at all the great things that can happen when you come from redress.
Melissa, what do white people Serious question?
No, it's a serious question. So, well, one of the things that successful redress movements get, and many of them are after war, right, is that, real material, an idea that we've righted a wrong, right, and that we've made some restitution. It is a way of, in some cases, settling the claim, like, okay, now we're done, right? That isn't always preferred, in part because one would think, well, this is an ongoing work and it can't be settled with one payment. But nonetheless, the idea that we've taken some positive measures and some consensus that the citizenship, or at least the material gains that are given to the beneficiaries, will somehow become part of the general whole because their citizenship has been affirmed and the like. We've kind of settled something. We've changed the balances in a way. We've made the scales right. Ta-Nehisi he talks about Israel, right? The debate in Israel about whether they should take money from Germany and the like, and it went both ways, right? But there was no gainsaying the material benefits, right, that Israel gained from getting those reparations from Germany. Real things to the state of Israel, right? So there's no gainsaying that, right? South Korea got money from Japan in 1965 for the war. That money was useful for helping build up South Korea. The Japanese didn't want to give it, right? But they had to in order to enter into settlements and finally settle the issue. So there is a way in which you seemingly turn the page. That sometimes makes people uncomfortable because they figure, why just turn the page? But that's a use. It can be the start of a better tomorrow with something material to make it real. So that's what's gained. And for people who would want to support it, you would say, look, it's not like we're finally getting rid of this issue, but rather we've done a good thing. We've acknowledged we've done a good thing. Our citizens are made better by it. We are a better nation because of it. That would seem to me to be a good thing versus what you described, which is that avoiding takes energy too, right?
Avoiding takes a lot of energy.
Avoiding takes energy. It's innovating. It takes away. It is draining. It is distorting.
Yes.
So my own research is on political identity and political polarization, and I'm wondering, like, in the near term, in the next couple of administrations, thinking about political polarization in this country, I think currently there's a lot of stories being put up in the public about, like, Ferguson or San Francisco, where I'm from, the police department there, and these stories being brought to light, and there's a lot of outrage that I'm seeing. But what I'm seeing, where I'm getting my analysis is a lot from, you, Ta-Nehisi, and like NPR's Code Switching blog. And I know that, like, on the other side, there's a lot of blowback from, sources farther on the right. And on the two ends, there's not a lot of negotiation. There's not a lot of coming together or compromise there in terms of creating analysis or discourse out of that. So I'm wondering, how do you guys look at political polarization affecting the discourse of race in the next couple of administrations, the next 20 years, say?
This is a hard question for me because I think I'm just going to venture out here. I have someone who's showing my names, but I think the work he's working on will not surprise any. The idea that at one point we were a much more bipartisan country strikes me as bizarre. I mean, certainly there was a period, you know, maybe like you want to talk about like the 50s, and maybe the 60s, you know, some part of the 60s, maybe the post-war period. I'm not quite convinced we're any more politically polarized than we were. I mean, we did fight a war. We just tried to kill each other. And that's the thing that happened. To that, I would add the fact that if you're black, I mean, I don't know that much has changed, you know. And I think like I could stretch that out to all other sorts of, you know, groups of people who, you know, lived in this country with a foot on their neck. Maybe it's more polarized for certain people, you know. But I don't know. I think we should be suspicious of that. You know, the notion that right now, you know, we're in a period where our institutions, which worked before, institutions which made white supremacy possible, by the way, the institutions through which white supremacy were communicated, are somehow less effective than you know they previously were. I'm just a little skeptical of that. Sir.
Well, my question is sort of what about Durham and Duke in this conversation? So in Durham, they have banned the box, but I don't think Duke has banned the box for job applications. And there's also tremendous gentrification, and redlining is still alive. And people in the community make use of this information to organize around. But what about here? And maybe, I don't know if people on the panel are experts on this, but I think it's relevant to this question.
You know, I think Michelle Alexander makes a great point in her book, The New Jim Crow. I don't know that ban the box gets you anywhere. Fine, now just discriminate against all black people. I'll just say all of you guys. And there's some evidence that that's actually already happening.
Yeah, well, we see it here as a step. You know, people are doing other things in terms of that. But I'm just saying, what about, if we're talking about reparations at a big scale, what about here? That's the heart of my question.
You know, gentrification has been on my mind in this conversation because it goes back to this dimension of the discussion, which is about narrative. You know, partly I come to this conversation having been an activist lawyer on the Lower East Side of New York in the 1980s and 90s, and our work, which very much built on the kind of community-based activist history around housing issues that Beryl describes in Chicago. By the time we got to the 1980s, we were now talking about gentrification. And in that work, we told a different story about the very same communities that you describe. The communities that had been constructed through redlining and the other systemic practices of the mid-20th century now, in a sense, became places that we valorized and we wanted to protect and sustain and maintain because remarkably, over 2 generations, they had taken on an integrity, right, for all of the inequality, right, that shaped them. They had a kind of integrity to them that we weren't prepared to see dismantled and disrupted by way of gentrification. And so it's really just a question about how those 2 narratives coexist. You know, I worked on the Lower East Side in the 80s and the 90s, and there comes a moment when you realize, like, the die has been cast on gentrification. That actually, it was in the 60s and the 70s, right, that the investment had been made in real estate, right, in property in the Lower East Side, and we were just now we were gonna tussle over how that played out. And I remember standing in the courthouse one day, and as lawyers do at lunchtime, and talk about all kinds of things, and a guy, an adversary who represented property owners in New York on the Lower East Side, said to me, "Oh, my client, he's done with this Lower East Side thing because he's investing all his money in Harlem." and I couldn't really process that in like 1989. You know, like I think it almost didn't compute, right? And now, of course, we like, you know, the collective, you know, chuckle is because we all know the way that story played out. So I don't really have a conclusion, but it's to say gentrification is part of what we talked about this morning, which is to say where do you draw the line, right? Where is the end of the story, right? Because we're all living through in various ways a dynamic that we might think of as gentrification, and through that we tell stories about places that we've come to love and honor and recognize as having a value for all that is not even in the face of all that is not just in those communities.
You know, hiring is up in Durham City after the
for that group, for black males.
Can I say one thing about the gentrification? I often got asked, writing a book about housing exploitation, 50s, 1950s, and 70s, what I thought about gentrification. And it was like the book I wrote was trying to make sort of simple and accessible how wealth is extracted from black communities because of mortgage and bank redlining, But I don't think we really have that yet for gentrification. Everyone has like, is it because of gay people? Is it, like people have these weird, something happened and, flipped and, who are we going to blame? And, or the artists or, and so I hope that somebody can do that. I mean, as I read about it, Neil Smith, decades ago wrote something where he said, well, actually, there are these tax laws, and you don't have to pay anything when you let the building go, and so you can let it go, and then you turn it at this exact moment, and then you can make a killing. And I was like, well, that's what I need to know, and that's the kind of information that will help people confront structural change. They have to understand the structures, and they're complicated. So it's something that people can do is to try and get on that and get that out and accessible as an analytic tool that we have in places like Durham or everywhere where it's going on, so we could actually talk about where the wealth is going precisely.
There was, yes.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry, I couldn't see.
Oh, no worries. Stay. So I'm just sort of thinking, like, the information that I've been privy to regarding systemic racism and, like, sort of reclaiming this, like, history of just, like, the Black experience in America has all happened at sort of the nexus of, like, capitalism and racism, which is a university. And I feel like I'm sort of undeservingly privy to this, like, secret, this, like, big information about reparations and about, like, racial history and understanding. But as someone who's also a community organizer and activist, I feel like the people who really, or at least people who are more deserving of this history, don't often have access to it. So I'm wondering, as like academics and scholars, how we bridge the gap. Like, how does someone who is homeless in Durham right now learn about like housing laws and federal housing programs, like those sorts of things, and how that they've systemically discriminated against them? So I guess if we knew the answer to that question, we'd be much better academics. But I just was wondering sort of the ideas you have on how we can bridge the gap between these sort of discussions we have, at universities or among people who subscribe to the Atlantic, and then folks that actually like need to probably like hear and have access to this information.
Wow, since we mentioned the Atlantic.
I think that your piece is like doing a good job of like starting to at least bridge the gap with the public. But.
Right. Well, I'll say two things. I mean, first of all, you should not feel undeserving. I'm not sure how much of a president is to begin with. Often, it is a present. Knowledge is great. Knowledge is a good thing, but it'll give you, some tough sleepless nights too. So I don't want you feeling guilty.
Okay.
And I just don't think guilt helps anything at all. I don't think it's a functional emotion. I don't, I think like, okay, we can acknowledge I feel a little bad about this, but the question really is, what are you going to do? I think that's much more helpful. And I think in terms of, folks who would characterize it as more deserving. First of all, very often they have an intuitive sense, what's going on. Again, even if they can't, put the exact scholarship. Listen, the funny thing about writing the case for it, and I was listening to Sandy this morning talking about how he came to, become an advocate, for reparations, and I heard so much of myself. I don't know how your household was, but I grew up in this like heavily radical, nationalist, quasi-nationalist household. And there were people around me in the community in which I lived, that were like, they owe us. And I grew up, with that tradition, went off to college, was a history major, got into some rigor, and, somehow it got lost in that. Like, somehow it's like, okay, well, that's something that people say, over here, but, some sort of rigorous analysis will clearly lead me to some other answer. And a rigorous analysis leads you right back to the people who you think don't have. In fact, they were correct. Again, folks can't, hopefully you come to do. And I think this is the value of the academy, right? You come to Duke, you come to Harvard, you come to Yale. In my case, you go to, Howard University, to get the science behind it. You understand? Like, to be able to do it on a really, really mathematical level, and to spell out what folks feel. As a journalist, like one of the, the great We have many shortcomings, but I think one of the great, bonuses of the field is, it puts you in touch with everyday people. And if you're gonna do the job, you quickly learn that you don't know as much as them. Even when you read books about it, you just don't. I mean, bro, like Clyde Ross could explain reparations in a way that, was just superior.
Right.
Superior. I mean, I went to his house. First time we sat down for the interview. I said, Mr. Ross, where are you from? He said, I was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I said, why did you come to Chicago? He said, because there was no law. And he speaks in this really thick Mississippi. I said, there was no law. Of course there was law. There were laws. I mean, he said, there was no law. I wanted the protection of the law. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they were white prosecutors, white judges, white cops. Whole system was white. People just take whatever you want. That's no law. I said, oh my God, that's profound. That's profound. I mean, again, I'm history major, read this and that. We can talk about Foucault or whatever. It didn't matter. He knew. He knew. So don't necessarily presume that you're, being gifted with a knowledge that folks don't have. And then you do, get some ability to explain what's going on in societal dynamics. So often, folks, man, the people who are living in it, know a little bit more than we might think.
I'll say that my book, when I was writing it, I had no background in urban history or anything like that, and I actually didn't read that many other urban historians when I was working on it, because I wanted to learn from the activists, and I think that is a message that more academics, it would be good if we could listen to the activists. I mean, I always feel like if you want to understand what's happening in any given place, talk to the activists. You could dig up the background for it once you do that, but they tend to have a really good sense. And so then my book did really well, but it's everything I learned from the activists, not from other urban historians who are stuck in a rut of, talking about four issues that they've been talking about for 20, 30 years, and that was it, So I just sidestepped them entirely, and wrote something that matters and people can read it. So I would like to see more of that. My partner is making a film about the watersheds in Detroit, and when she was talking about doing that, she said, wow, where do I start? I said, talk to the activists. She's been talking to the activists in Detroit, and she's come up with this profoundly systematic, structural understanding what's happening there. So, and then she's going to put that out and let them tell their stories. So that, to me, is the best way to bridge these divides. So she goes to the activists for to the academics, for some sort of historical background of the things that the activists are identifying. But she doesn't let them frame it. So that's what I recommend.
Okay, so we're running short. I want to get, who was you? You had your hand up early, and you in the back. I want to make sure you guys get to ask your question.
Yeah, you said, I want to, actually, there's about 10 things, but I'll just limit it to 2. One is something you said, you don't think things have changed, you were skeptical of that.
I didn't say that. I didn't say I don't think things have changed.
So you're skeptical of the idea that things have changed. That's what I thought you said. You didn't say that?
I think it's you mean in the long term? I don't know. I think it's a lot different than somebody being able to auction off your kid. I think that's a real difference.
Well, yeah, but I'm just talking about when I was a student here in the late 60s, early 70s, it was controversial to even establish an African American Studies department. What did African Americans do? I won't say what the real word was, but what did they ever do for this country? And the whole exceptionalist idea, America is the indispensable country, the exceptional country, and you're an American hater if you don't agree with that. That whole idea, seems to me, is the idea that really needs to be destroyed. The exceptional country. That we're actually different. That people here are somehow different from people elsewhere, or the Constitution somehow makes us different from people in other places. And that if we get rid of that, then we really prepare the culture at large for the idea of reparations, because then black people become no different from anybody else, and white people become no different from anybody else. And really, politics, at the end of the day, will follow culture. The young people growing up today, at least from what I've heard and from what I've seen from my daughter and her friends, are ready for that message. And they're ready for black people and white people who are no different from each other. And if they grow up in the World War II people and who believe that this country saved the world, who believe that this country is somehow really special and different from everybody else, go, which they are going every day now, I think, this country will be different.
So I'm a little skeptical of that. Mostly, I wanted, just because with your, you can bring an international perspective. How important is national identity important when we talk about reparations? I'm a little skeptical that without national identity you can get that. I wonder what your thoughts are.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand it, other than to say, I guess I want to be clear on the question. So, does national identity matter for reparations?
Is it enough? Is it? Well, let me break this down into two questions. I'm not sure that Americans are original in believing that it's exceptional. Do all countries have some sort of
Right.
belief in
Yeah, they
that?
do.
Okay, if they do, what is that?
Well, all countries think that they're unique in some kind of way. The U.S. may be a little bit different in terms of its exceptionalism, in part because of its global status for much of the 20th century. So,
Do other countries say that they're indispensable? They're the indispensable country? Is what the right wing
well,
says about this country?
I mean, a lot of countries think that they're special in different kinds of ways. The difference would be that the U.S. has been able to project global power, right? So it's more the projection of U.S. power than, but we are not unique. Every country's got its own sense of its own national identity, and some may be a bit more chauvinistic than others. I think that's true in others, but we're not. But the difference is that the global status of the U.S. has made our view of ourselves much more consequential to the rest of the planet than other countries. I did like your remarks though about the idea of the generations, so that as each generation passes, views about reparations may well change, right? Or views about dealing with the past. So it wasn't until really the late 60s, early 70s when Germans began to take on in a real way kind of the Holocaust. I mean, they're still dealing with that, right? But Japanese are still dealing with the generation. So years after the war, right? World War II. So there is something to be said for generational change over time. It's having its own way of helping us rewrite our history.
Yes, I definitely appreciate you for allowing me to say a little something. Someone said something earlier about the activists in the community. And so I'm one of those activists that's in the community. I have a community center, New Community Development Center. And I'm here today just to hear from the academic world related to this particular subject. What I wanted to say was, we will continue to have this discussion, but as we continue to have this discussion, it will evolve into like an onion, layers. My mother, 76 years of age, born and raised in the South, school teacher, and yet during Jim Crow, she was one who was not compensated. One who was, I guess you would say in a sense, underrepresented, but yet taxed. And so that's another angle of reparations. Then we spoke about gentrification or even urban renewal. And the area in which I work in is on the south side of Durham. And so as you all know, the South Side Revitalization Project, which has just been put up, there's a big sign out on the front that said, be the new kid on the block. And so now it's being gentrified, and the people who once lived in that area have been displaced. So basically, this is a Hurricane Katrina without the water. So we'll continue to hear the discussion of reparations, but the layers will continue to thicken. So, and that was just the only point that I wanted to make. And then I know the gentleman earlier said something about redress. If we look at the island of Haiti, where the African in Haiti had to fight not only the French, but the Spaniards, as well as the British. And after they won, the French imposed reparations on them. And so now when we look at Haiti, who basically has still been destroyed, and we look at France, we see where you do benefit from redress.
Okay, I think we are. One more. Okay, all right. Hey, man, I'll go all day. Okay, all right. Okay.
So I had a question about white privilege because it seems like it's pretty essential to this debate about reparations.
Can you stand up and ask your question?
Yeah, so I guess it just seems like a lot of white Americans have some anxieties about these privileges that they feel historically entitled to. So as a student, I guess my question is like, how can we initiate and cultivate these conversations on white privilege while simultaneously pointing out the ways in which Black Americans have been like systemically disadvantaged? And I know this is a structural issue, so I don't want to like put the onus on the individual, but I mean, how do we get these conversations to happen in a sustainable manner?
Oh boy. Starbucks, yeah, that's a good They tried. So this is a question I get, from time to time when talking to young folks, and I'm going to give one answer, and I'm hoping that folks on here will give a much more optimistic answer, because I don't know how helpful my answer is going to be, honestly. Writing for me is like a deeply selfish act. Obviously, and I mean that even for somebody who case for reparations. Beryl was talking about something earlier. She said, you face like the possibility of, well, and even if this, stars go out, she's talking about this Baldwin piece, at least you know. And I get great personal relief and pleasure out of knowing. I'm from West Baltimore, and I tell people how when I went to middle school, each day I was faced with this suite of choices. What was I going to wear? How was I going to cock my hat? How was I going to wear my book bag? How was I going to wear my coat? How many people were walking with me? Where were they from? Once I got to school, was I, staying after school? For coach class, was I leaving at the right time? Was I going to go to my grandmother's house? Was I going to go home? All of these choices were about the safety of my body. Every single one. Every single one was about how am I not going to get jumped? Or if I get jumped, am I going to be ready? And how am I going to be ready? When I was in school, I would say fully a third of my brain was occupied with my personal safety, and the other 2/3 was left over for school. And I would come home, I watch Family Ties, or The Wonder Years, or Mr. Belvedere, or whatever show there was about this broader country, where it was quite clear to me. And no one had to worry about that. With young people, young boys were trying to become Eagle Scouts, thinking about I got poison ivy. Whatever things that young boys who weren't were thinking about, and I could not understand the chasm, the space. Why was it everybody in my world, who were Black, felt as I felt, kind of lived in fear, and I could go to all sorts of cities. I could see my dad's friends in Chicago, go see my family in Philly and New Jersey, and it was the same sort of fear that was there, and yet out in the broader country, this fear was not present. My work gives me the ability to explain that, to not, live in mystery, to not, when someone says maybe you also just pull your pants up, to understand, to not be lied to. And that's a great, great personal relief to me. You can really, really lose yourself trying to explain that to people who have an interest in not knowing. And I think there has to be some, clarity around. And I'm not saying, I don't want this to say I'm anti-debate, discussion. Because I'm not. I think it's, obviously I write now, write for a match. So I think you can lay out the facts as they are. But I think young people need to be aware that there are interests in the world. And those interests are not, just ignorant people who, quote unquote, are working against their own. And white supremacy is an interest in this country that people engage in. I was, listening to your vocabulary. So the new thing, right, people talk about white privilege, and I think beneath that is the idea, well, maybe we don't say racism. Maybe we don't say white, maybe they'll get, no, they know exactly what you mean. You can't fool them with you. It's very, very intelligent. It's very, very intelligent. And when you change the words, it's not going to make the conversation go any easier. I just don't think, I go to these schools and I get white kids and they come to me, I'm aware of my privilege. Well, I'm happy for you. That's what you need to say. But the debate actually remains the same. The problem is the same. The problem is still there. And so I think the first thing, you should do is, refine, why, you're on this mission of exploration and knowing. And I think, you have to get back. And I'm saying this, but, I think it's very, very important, for young Black kids, for kids of color, to understand, what you get out of it so that you don't allow yourself to go crazy when somebody looks at you like you're crazy. I think that's really, really important that you don't let folks drive you crazy. But I think the second part of that is being really, really realistic about what you're going to get out of conversations. It can't be, how do I convert the campus, the student body of Duke out of its racism? That's just not going to happen. You may get one or two. And That's a good, that's excellent. That's some good work you did right there. But I think, just as we were talking about, expectations and, the possibilities of reform, we have to be very, very clear, about what we're doing here. The pursuit of knowledge is not simply for them. It's for you. I mean, it really, it has rewards for you, and you just should never, ever lose sight of it. Don't let other people, occupy that space. Don't let them take that from you.
And I'd say that you avoid guilt and guilt tripping and guilt all of that. I do think that clouds thinking instead of illuminates. Privilege, you say somebody got white privilege, like, well, I'm not privileged, my family's poor, but blah, blah, blah. No, don't tell me I'm privileged, that you're going to get that kind of thing. So I think it's important, just as it's empowering for an African American person to have clarity about the system in which they live. It so can be for any person in America to have some clarity. And so again, I just want to, try when you think about these conversations, cast them in terms of, something, an opening up of, intellectual and political understanding that will empower many people in many ways for whatever it is they choose to deal with. It doesn't have to be racism. It can be another kind of exploitation or oppression. But once they understand this one, they could understand sexism. They could understand homophobia. They could understand, all kinds of biases that will hit them in one way or another. It's about understanding how people hurt people without in a systematic way, not in an individual way. So I think that kind of connections across differences is a way to go as well.
So go ahead. You go ahead. We began with Baldwin, and I pulled up what for me is my favorite Baldwin quote. Because for me, Baldwin reminds me that I need to know myself, and I need to know my own ethical core, whatever challenge I propose to take on in my university, in my community, and in the world. So Baldwin talks about love, and I think that love is getting a bad rap. It's about the Starbucks cup, and it's about common, and talking to white folks in elevators, But so he says, Baldwin says, love is a tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. And he goes on, though, to say that it makes us vulnerable, right? That kind of quest makes us vulnerable because it forces us to show ourselves. He says, love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. And so I think there's a sense for me in which the question you pose and the kind of intervention that you hope to bring to your own community necessarily requires a kind of vulnerability that I at least want to acknowledge, right? That there isn't a way to do that work and to do it ethically and powerfully without also making yourself vulnerable, and that means taking care of ourselves also. I think for me, I know you love us, right? Because it's this kind of love, right? It's not, and that I feel in the writing, and so.
I do. Now I feel badly because I'm going to say something that isn't quite so. I just want to put in the room for guilt. That I actually think guilt is important. And it may not be the emotion that you end with, but it's not a bad one to start with. And in part because, I say it for two reasons. One is, people who tend to feel guilty tend to want to do something, right? I mean, it creates empathy. It creates motivation. It may not, now you don't want to stay with it always, but guilt requires reflection. What am I feeling guilty about? Often I feel bad. Okay, so it's empathy, right? Why do I feel bad? When you may be somehow seeing yourself in that person, or at least empathizing in a way that is more connected to your experience. So it seems to me, and then a lot of social scientific research shows in all kinds of experiments that people who feel guilty tend to support apologies. They tend to support measures that the government wants to do. stay in guilt, right? But I don't see a whole lot of guilty Americans, right? So it seems to me.
So you think like white guilt is totally myth? Like it's this a myth? Like white people actually don't feel guilty?
They don't want to. Yeah, don't want. Yeah, kind of. There's a lot of ways not to feel guilty, to talk yourself out of guilt. You know, there's not a lot here that, because immediately you begin to feel guilty, well, you know, they deserve it, or you know, there's something immediately comes right behind it that chases guilt away, right? So I don't see a whole lot of privileged people in any country. You know, typically there are all kinds of self-reinforcing narratives of why I deserve this. I mean, desert, right? Desert is much more powerful and usually the winner in the fight between guilt and desert. I deserve it. Right? I mean, there's guilt, yeah, but you know, really, so it seems to me we could probably stand to do a little bit more guilt before we run off, and so I'm going to put in the plea for guilt. And zero.
That's a nice note. Guilty, you're going to go out acting love.